He wore the badge by day and carried the gun by night, and nobody in Sao Paulo's dark, forgotten outskirts could tell the difference between justice and murder, because with this man, there was none. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we explore 3 unsettling cases where the truth hid beneath what first appeared completely harmless. Behind this story are countless hours spent reviewing sources, piecing together details, and striving for accuracy. Each element was included thoughtfully, with respect for the real events at its center. The goal of this channel is to keep these stories from fading into history. Now, please take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the badge and the bullet. Brazil's deadliest shadow in uniform. This is Floresvaldo de Oliveira, aka Cabo Bruno, the corporal who made Sao Paulo's streets run red. Now let's begin. Picture a city already on its knees. Sao Paulo in the early 1980s. A sprawling, suffocating concrete jungle where the poor were stacked like forgotten cargo in the suburbs, where the law was a rumor whispered between crumbling walls, and where darkness arrived not just with the setting sun but in the form of a man behind the wheel of a color-changing car, cruising slowly through the night with a loaded weapon and a list in his head that no court had ever approved. His name was Floresvaldo de Oliveira, but the streets did not call him that. The streets called him Cabo Bruno, and when that name echoed through the alleys of Jabaquara, people locked their doors, pulled their children close, and prayed they had done nothing to catch his eye. Because Cabo Bruno did not arrest. He did not warn. He did not hesitate. He simply arrived, and then someone stopped breathing. Over 50 people. Gone. Not in war. Not in self-defense. Executed in the shadows of a city that was too broken, too afraid, and in some twisted way, too grateful to stop him. This is the story of the man who made a uniform into a costume for slaughter, who turned his days off into hunting seasons, and who walked free after 27 years, only to meet the same fate he had delivered to dozens of others. Pull in close. This story does not slow down. Please, if you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. There are places in the world that shape people in ways no school, no church, and no conversation can fully explain. Yucua, a small municipality tucked into the interior of Sao Paulo state, Brazil, was where Floresvaldo de Oliveira entered the world on November 18, 1958. It was an unremarkable beginning. A boy born into the ordinary rhythms of small-town Brazilian life, in a state that was growing louder and more chaotic by the decade. No one who knew the infant could have looked into his eyes and seen the trail of corpses that would follow him across the years. No prophecy hung over his cradle. No mark distinguished him from thousands of other boys born into the heat and dust of Sao Paulo state's interior. And yet, something was being assembled inside him, slowly, quietly, like a weapon being cleaned and loaded in a back room where no one thinks to look. His childhood unfolded largely in Catanduva, a city not far from Yucua, and it was there that the nickname was born. The story behind it is almost laughably mundane, the kind of detail that belongs in a childhood anecdote, not a criminal file. His friends, in the way that young people do with the particular cruelty of teasing, began comparing him to a local alcoholic known simply as Bruno. It was mockery. It was a joke. But the name attached itself to Floresvaldo with a tenacity that nothing in his later life could shake loose. Even his own mother stopped calling him Floresvaldo and began using Bruno exclusively. What was meant as a provocation became an identity, and identities, once worn long enough, begin to shape the man beneath them. By the time the world would come to fear the name Cabo Bruno, very few people even remembered what his real name was. As a young man, Floresvaldo made a choice that would give his future violence both structure and cover. He joined the military police of Sao Paulo state. In the Brazil of the late 1970s and early 1980s, the military police were an institution carrying the still-fading weight of the country's military dictatorship, which had only formally ended in 1985. The culture within its ranks was, in many corners, brutal by default. Violence was a tool. Authority was absolute. And the boundaries between law enforcement and personal execution were, in certain units and certain officers, distressingly thin. For a man like Floresvaldo, a man who would later describe his killings as driven by a hatred of outlaws, the military police was not simply a career. It was a calling. It was permission. It handed him a weapon, a rank, and a uniform that announced to every person he encountered: this man has the power of the state behind him. He rose to the rank of corporal, cabo in Portuguese, and it was this rank that fused permanently with his nickname, Cabo Bruno, the corporal. It had a menacing rhythm to it, and in time, São Paulo's southern outskirts would learn to dread those two syllables the way people dread the sound of a knock on the door in the middle of the night. But the uniform, the rank, and the badge were only the scaffolding. The actual architecture of what Cabo Bruno would become was being built in something far darker. In a philosophy, however twisted, that he seemed to genuinely believe. He despised criminals. Or rather, he despised what he decided a criminal looked like. And that distinction between what someone had done and what they appeared to be would prove catastrophic for dozens of people who simply had the misfortune of fitting his internal image of guilt. The São Paulo of 1982 was a city stretched to breaking point. Rapid urbanization had pushed millions of working-class Brazilians into the peripheral neighborhoods, the favelas and districts that sprawled outward from the city's wealthy center like rings on a bruised eye. Crime in these areas was real and visible: drug dealing, theft, petty violence, the entire ecosystem of poverty's most desperate expressions. And it was into this world that Cabo Bruno descended, not as a police officer performing his duties, but as something far more sinister. A self-appointed executioner operating in the darkness between his official shifts. He acted almost exclusively on his days off. That detail is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reveals something important about the psychology of the man. This was not an officer who snapped under pressure in the line of duty. This was not a single act of terrible judgment in a difficult moment. This was deliberate. This was scheduled. When other officers went home to their families, ate dinner, rested, Cabo Bruno went hunting. He climbed into one of several cars he used: a Chevrolet Chevette, a Ford Maverick, a Chevrolet Opala, each one painted in colors that were regularly changed to prevent recognition. He drove through the streets of the Jabaquara district and the broader southern zone of São Paulo, and he looked for people who matched the image in his head. Drug dealers, pimps, thieves, men with tattoos. Men who looked like they did not belong in whatever version of Order Cabo Bruno had constructed in his mind. And then he shot them. It was that straightforward, that swift, that devoid of ceremony. He did not confront his targets. He did not arrest them. He did not give them the opportunity to speak, to explain, to prove him wrong. He pulled alongside them or approached on foot, raised his weapon, and fired. The bodies fell in alleys, on pavements, in the scrubland at the edges of the city. Some were discovered quickly. Others were found days later, already beginning to return to the earth. The bullets that ended their lives were not fired in anger or in panic. They were delivered with the cold, deliberate efficiency of a man who had thought about this, who had decided this was right, and who felt no tremor in his hand as he pulled the trigger. The Jabaquara district became his primary hunting ground. Residents of the area began to notice a particular, terrible quiet that settled over their streets during certain hours of the night. The kind of quiet that is not peaceful but terrified. The kind that happens when everyone in a neighborhood has unconsciously learned to stay indoors because something dangerous is circling. Some of those residents would later say, with a complicated mixture of feelings that Brazil's newspapers would wrestle with for decades, that in Cabo Bruno's time there was somehow less insecurity. What they meant, though most could not fully articulate it, was that the criminals they feared most were themselves afraid of something worse. And Cabo Bruno was that something worse. A predator positioned just above the existing predators in the food chain, clearing them away with gunfire and leaving a silence that the community mistook, in its exhaustion and desperation, for safety. But safety built on secret executions is not safety at all. It is terror wearing a different mask. And the bodies that began accumulating in São Paulo's southern neighborhoods throughout 1982 were evidence of something the city desperately did not want to confront. That a uniformed officer of the state was methodically killing its citizens on his leisure time, and that powerful people within the institution he served either knew, suspected, or actively facilitated what he was doing. Later investigations would reveal that Cabo Bruno did not act entirely alone. The military police's own internal assessments concluded that at least 12 police officers, including 2 senior officials, a captain and a lieutenant, were believed to be involved in or connected to a series of executions in São Paulo's South Zone. Whether this was a formal death squad, an informal network of like-minded officers, or a looser arrangement of men who shared targets and information without explicit coordination has never been fully established. What is clear is that the culture surrounding Cabo Bruno enabled him, shielded him, and for a critical period, protected him from the consequences that any civilian carrying out 50 murders would have faced immediately. The traders of the district were reportedly among the parties who paid for his services. This is the dimension of Cabo Bruno's story that shifts it from the narrative of a disturbed individual into something far more systemic and far more disturbing. The possibility, supported by testimony and investigative reporting, that merchants hired him to eliminate people they considered threats to their businesses or their neighborhoods. Whether money changed hands, how much, and how often has never been conclusively documented. Cabo Bruno himself denied that traders were his clients. But the suggestion, and the credible weight of evidence behind it, places his murders not just in the territory of personal pathology, but in the murky, deeply unsettling territory of contracted civilian execution. He was, in the language of the streets, a justiciero, a vigilante, a self-styled purger of the undesirable, and in that role he found, horrifyingly, something close to community approval. The year 1982 would become the bloodiest chapter of Cabo Bruno's campaign. By the time the calendar turned and investigators began trying to piece together what had happened across São Paulo's southern outskirts, the evidence of his work was everywhere, but it was scattered, disorganized, and in many cases, deliberately obscured by the very institutions that should have been pursuing him. Bodies riddled with bullets were found throughout the region with a frequency that caused genuine panic among residents. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone willing to look. Multiple gunshot wounds, execution-style positioning, no witnesses willing to come forward, and a specific geography that kept returning investigators to the same districts, the same streets, the same dark corners where Cabo Bruno had apparently decided the worst of humanity congregated. His method was consistent in its brutality and its efficiency. He did not torture. He did not prolong. He arrived, he fired, and he left. The victims were hit multiple times. The kind of shooting that announces not just a desire to kill but a determination to leave no possibility of survival, no room for the situation to be reversed, no chance that the target might live to identify him. It was overkill in the most literal sense, and it spoke to a man who was either deeply afraid of failure or deeply committed to finality. Perhaps both. The cars he used were always changing color. A detail that speaks to planning, to awareness, to the understanding that he was building a reputation that would eventually lead people to look for him. He changed the paint on his vehicles the way a predator changes its approach when it senses the hunt is closing in on it. And the hunt was slowly closing in, though far more slowly than it should have. The accumulation of bullet-riddled bodies throughout 1982 was impossible to ignore indefinitely, and reporters and investigators began connecting the dots. But the dots kept leading toward a man in uniform, and in Brazil in 1982, that was a place where many investigations lost their momentum. The military police was a powerful institution. Officers protected other officers. And Cabo Bruno, as would later emerge, appeared to have the implicit shelter of senior ranks who were either complicit in his activities or unwilling to expose an institution already straining under the weight of the country's political transition. It was in this environment that one man came extraordinarily close to becoming one of Cabo Bruno's confirmed victims, and survived only through extraordinary presence of mind. José Aparecido Benedito became the sole known survivor of Cabo Bruno's targeting. Shot, left for dead, his body presumably destined to join the growing tally of the executed. Benedito did not die. He lay perfectly still, controlling his breathing, his fear, and every instinct that screamed at him to move, to run, to cry out. He played dead with a precision that saved his life, while Cabo Bruno presumably walked away satisfied with another completed task. When the danger had passed sufficiently, Benedito moved. He escaped, and his survival, quiet and unremarked for some time, would eventually become part of the evidentiary architecture that brought Cabo Bruno to justice. The sheer breadth of the killing, 50 or more lives taken across a compressed period concentrated most heavily in a single year, raises a question that haunts every aspect of this case. How was this allowed to continue so long? The honest answer is that it was allowed to continue because of who was doing it and who was benefiting from it. The residents of Jabbaquara and the surrounding districts lived in a city that provided them almost no reliable protection. The police were not a source of safety for these communities in any meaningful, consistent way. Crime was real and present and frightening. And then there was this man, this uniformed officer who was, in the minds of some, doing what the official system refused to do. He was removing, with permanent brutality, the people who made their lives unsafe. This is the most disturbing moral dimension of the Cabo Bruno case, and it deserves to be examined directly rather than smoothed over. In communities abandoned by functional law enforcement, vigilantism fills the vacuum. People who have no faith in courts, no trust in police, and no access to the mechanisms of civil justice begin to accept, and in some cases welcome, extrajudicial violence, not because they are bloodthirsty, but because they are desperate. The merchants who allegedly hired Cabo Bruno, the neighbors who looked the other way, the community members who said the district was somehow safer under his reign of shadow execution, they were not celebrating murder for its own sake. They were expressing the despair of people who had been left with no other option and had simply made their peace with a terrible one. But Cabo Bruno's violence was not surgical, however much he may have believed it was. His criteria for selection were terrifyingly broad and demonstrably wrong. He killed people not because he had evidence of their crimes, but because of how they looked. A young man with a small cross tattooed on his wrist was shot dead. To Cabo Bruno, any tattoo on any person was the mark of criminality. It did not matter that this particular tattoo was religious, devotional, personal. It did not matter that the boy who wore it may have been entirely innocent of anything. What mattered was that he fitted the profile, the internal image of guilt that Cabo Bruno had constructed and carried around like a second weapon. And so he died. This killing, one among many, documented in the investigations, is perhaps the most shattering illustration of what Cabo Bruno's self-appointed justice actually was. Not the removal of proven criminals. Not even the execution of people widely known within their communities to be dangerous. But the murder of people who looked wrong to one man. One man who had appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner. One man who had access to weapons, vehicles, and the cover of a uniform. One man whose colleagues and superiors apparently preferred to look in another direction. The political complexity deepened further when it became clear that the network surrounding Cabo Bruno included senior officers. A captain and a lieutenant, men of rank and institutional authority, were implicated in the broader pattern of executions. Whether their involvement was direct, supervisory, or merely permissive remains, to this day, not fully resolved. But the implication is deeply corrosive. That the execution of civilians in São Paulo's poorest suburbs was not simply the aberration of one unstable corporal, but part of a broader institutional culture in which certain officers had decided that the law was optional, that some lives were expendable, and that they could do this because no one who mattered would stop them. Throughout 1982 and into 1983, Cabo Bruno continued. The bodies continued. The panic in the community continued. And then, slowly, the weight of evidence began to do what institutional protection could not indefinitely prevent. Witnesses were coming forward. People who had seen things, who had recognized the changing colored cars, who knew who Cabo Bruno was and what he did, began speaking. Carefully, fearfully, but speaking. The case against him was building. The journalist Caco Barcelos, a reporter of extraordinary tenacity and moral clarity, began covering the accumulation of evidence in ways that pierced through the institutional fog and brought the story of Cabo Bruno to the national consciousness. It was Barcelos who would later cover Cabo Bruno's final imprisonment for the Jornal Nacional, Brazil's most prominent evening news program. His reporting transformed Cabo Bruno from a local fear into a national reckoning, a figure through whom Brazil was forced to confront the violence at the heart of its own law enforcement culture. By September 1983, the evidence had reached the point at which a court order was secured. On September 22, 1983, Floresvaldo de Oliveira, Cabo Bruno, was arrested for the first time. He was recognized by multiple witnesses. He was charged with more than 20 murders. And Brazil turned its eyes toward the man who had spent a year and a half making São Paulo's outskirts into a killing field, and began the long, complicated, deeply imperfect process of trying to hold him accountable. The arrest of Cabo Bruno in September 1983 should have been the moment at which the violence was contained, catalogued, and definitively punished. In theory, the machinery of Brazilian justice would now take over, examine the evidence, hear the witnesses, and render a verdict that reflected the scale of what this man had done. In practice, what followed was one of the most complicated, prolonged, and at times bewildering legal processes in modern Brazilian criminal history. A sequence of 12 separate trials that stretched across years, during which Cabo Bruno alternated between confession and denial with a fluency that suggested he understood, perhaps better than most, exactly how fragile the line between conviction and acquittal could be. In his initial testimony, Cabo Bruno admitted to only a single murder. On February 6, 1982, in the slum of Jardim Selma, he had killed a man. He confessed to this one act because the evidence was overwhelming. A friend of the victim had survived and denounced him. On everything else, he maintained a posture of denial, silence, or careful deflection. The more than 50 murders attributed to him were, in his telling, not entirely his responsibility. He had been present for some. He had been misidentified for others. And for many, he claimed that other individuals, killers who had heard of his reputation and used the name Cabo Bruno as cover for their own crimes, were responsible. This last claim was not entirely implausible, and it introduced a layer of genuine complexity into the prosecutorial case. By 1983, the name Cabo Bruno had become a brand of sorts in the criminal underworld of São Paulo's outskirts, a name associated with extrajudicial execution carried out by someone connected to the police. It was at least conceivable that other killers had invoked that name to claim credit for murders or to deflect suspicion onto a figure who was already known. His second wife later articulated this possibility directly, saying that some of the people attributed to his record had in fact been killed by others who presented themselves under his name. She also, with a bluntness that cuts through everything, described his eventual admission of responsibility for approximately 20 murders as pragmatic rather than sincere. "It would not make much difference," she recalled him saying. The implication being that the numbers were already so large, so legally overwhelming, that precision had become irrelevant. Through 12 separate trials, a number that alone speaks to the extraordinary complexity and contentiousness of the proceedings, the legal case against Cabo Bruno was constructed, challenged, appealed, and reconstructed. Fellow police officers appeared in court on at least one occasion, not as prosecutors or investigators, but as a pressure group, attempting to influence the proceedings in his favor. The evidence, however, was substantial enough that their presence did not prevent conviction. Ultimately, Cabo Bruno was sentenced to 113 years in prison, a number that reflected the scale of his crimes even as it strained against the boundaries of human arithmetic. But conviction, in this case, proved to be only a partial containment. Cabo Bruno escaped from custody 3 separate times. 3 times he walked away from the institutions designed to hold him, moving through the cracks of a system that struggled to contain one of its own. Each escape added another chapter to the mythology surrounding him, another demonstration that the man was as difficult to hold as he was to stop. The third and final escape occurred on May 30th, 1991. After this last disappearance, he was eventually recaptured and placed in the José Augusto César Salgado Penitentiary in Tremembe, a maximum security institution from which, finally, he did not escape again. What happened to Cabo Bruno inside that prison is one of the genuinely strange and disorienting aspects of a case already full of strangeness. The man who had killed with cold deliberation, who had spent his leisure hours cruising Sao Paulo's streets in color-changing vehicles looking for people to shoot, who had executed a boy for the tattoo of a cross on his wrist. This man became, within prison walls, a pastor. He converted to evangelical Christianity. He rejected the name Bruno, requesting that those around him no longer use it, though it continued to follow him everywhere, the way dark histories do. He took up painting, and in 1998, an exhibition of his oil-on acrylic works was held in Sao Paulo. He married inside prison in July 2008 to a woman who had come to the penitentiary as a volunteer, a housewife who found in this particular convicted mass murderer something she considered worth loving. The conversion drew skepticism that is both understandable and appropriate. Brazil has a long tradition of convicted criminals, particularly those connected to the state's history of institutional violence, finding religion in prison and presenting a transformed self to a system that, under certain legal frameworks, is required to take that transformation into account when making decisions about release. Whether Cabo Bruno's faith was genuine, theatrical, or somewhere in the ambiguous territory between the two is something that cannot be definitively determined. What can be observed is that it was effective. As a pastor working in the prison's ecumenical chapel, he accumulated a record of good conduct and institutional praise. He even counted among his followers, at one point, a man named Lindenberg Alves, a name that would later become notorious in its own right for a separate, devastating hostage crisis in Brazil. In 2009, having served approximately 1/6 of his 113-year sentence, Cabo Bruno applied for a transfer to a semi-open regime. The state prosecutor's office requested a criminological and psychosocial examination, a two-stage process carried out by professionals tasked with assessing whether this man posed a continuing threat to society. The examination returned with a favorable opinion. The transfer was granted on August 19, 2009. Even in the semi-open regime, however, the courts denied him the benefit of temporary leave, a privilege that, given his history of 3 escapes, they determined he would only be eligible for after 2017. But the legal momentum was moving in one direction. The combination of his formally assessed good behavior, the documentation of his conduct provided by prison officials and the P2 Division's own management, and a Brazilian law that made provision for the definitive release of prisoners who had demonstrated sustained good behavior and served more than 20 years. All of these converged on a single court decision. On August 22, 2012, a court in Taubaté granted Floresvaldo de Oliveira his freedom. After 27 years of imprisonment, a fraction of the 113-year sentence handed down for the murders of over 50 people, Cabo Bruno walked out of prison. He was 53 years old. He had served less than a quarter of his sentence. More than 50 families had buried people who would never grow older. And the man who put them in the ground carried a laminated copy of his release order everywhere he went, along with a handwritten list of 10 dreams he wished to accomplish before he died. He spoke about his release with something approaching levity, joking about how during his escapes the police always stopped him, but now that he had his official freedom order, no one would stand in his way. The bitter irony of that statement would become fully visible in just over a month. When Floresvaldo de Oliveira walked out of the penitentiary in August 2012, he stepped into a Brazil that had changed significantly since 1983. The country's economy had transformed. The cities had sprawled further. Its political landscape bore little resemblance to the military-inflected culture in which he had come of age and committed his crimes. But certain things in Brazil, certain deep structural realities about violence, memory, and the long reach of past transgressions, had not changed at all. And it was into the shadow of those unchanged realities that Cabo Bruno walked on the first day of his freedom and every day that followed. He was, by all visible accounts, attempting to live the life of a reformed man. His evangelical faith, which had carried him through his years in Tremembe, remained the structure around which he organized his days. He was connected to religious communities, attending services, maintaining the pastoral identity he had built inside prison. He carried his release papers everywhere. He had his list of 10 dreams. Whether those dreams were modest or ambitious, practical or spiritual, the people who knew him in those final weeks described a man who was trying to inhabit the life that faith and time had apparently given him back. On the night of September 26, 2012, Cabo Bruno was returning from a religious service in the municipality of Aparecida, a city of profound spiritual significance in Brazil, home to the national shrine of Our Lady of Aparecida, the patron saint of the country. He was with relatives. They were traveling together through the night, the quiet intimacy of family movement, the normalcy of a shared journey after an evening of worship. In the neighborhood of Quadracaberta, in Pindamonhangaba, at approximately 11:30 in the evening, this ordinary family night ended with sudden, catastrophic violence. Two men arrived on foot. They targeted one person, Floresvaldo de Oliveira. They fired between 18 and 20 shots. None of his relatives were touched. The precision of the attack, its exclusive, deliberate focus on a single individual while leaving others in the immediate vicinity completely unharmed, removed any ambiguity about its nature. This was not a random attack. This was not a robbery gone wrong. There was no robbery announced, no property taken, no chaotic spray of gunfire into a group of people. This was a targeted execution, carried out with a professionalism that mirrored, in its cold efficiency, the dozens of executions Cabo Bruno himself had delivered across São Paulo's outskirts 3 decades earlier. He was declared dead at the scene. A hospital was unnecessary. The shell casings collected by crime scene investigators told the technical story of his death. Rounds from a .40 Smith & Wesson and from a .380 ACP, 2 different weapons, 2 different shooters, working in coordinated synchrony. A car was seen in the vicinity, presumed to have been used by the attackers for their escape. By the time the military police arrived in full force, the men who had shot him were gone. The investigation into his killing was handed to the civil police. No credible leads materialized. The identities of the 2 men who arrived on foot that night in Pindamonhangaba and delivered 18 to 20 bullets into the body of Brazil's most notorious police-uniformed serial killer were never established. No arrests were made. The case, in an irony so precise it seems constructed, remained officially unsolved. The man who had walked away from justice for years, who had escaped from custody 3 times, who had been freed after serving 27 years of a 113-year sentence, finally received a form of reckoning from sources that the courts and the formal system of justice had never managed to produce. Who killed Cabo Bruno? The question hangs in the air of Brazilian true crime the way smoke hangs in a room after a fire has been extinguished, present, pervasive, and without a clear source. The list of possibilities is not short. In the course of his murders across 1982 and 1983, Cabo Bruno had devastated more than 50 families. Those families had waited. They had watched. They had seen him convicted, had seen the sentence of 113 years handed down, and had perhaps felt something close to relief. And then they had watched him escape 3 times. And then they had watched him granted a semi-open regime. And then, in 2012, they had received the news that after 27 years, he was free. The grief of losing a loved one to a gunman on a São Paulo pavement does not diminish with time. Neither does the fury at watching that gunman walk into freedom carrying a laminated release order and a bucket list. Beyond the families of his victims, there were other dimensions to consider. The criminal ecosystems he had disrupted during his killing years had long memories. Drug-dealing networks do not forget the people who eliminated their members. The underworld has its own arithmetic, its own timeline for settling accounts, and 30 years is not too long to wait when the opportunity for resolution has not previously presented itself. There were also questions never fully answered about what Cabo Bruno knew regarding the police officers who had been connected to the broader pattern of executions in São Paulo's South Zone. A man who had been at the center of that network, who had survived, who had been in the legal system for 27 years, who might at any point have said more than he had so far said about who else was involved and what orders had come from where, such a man might represent, to certain people in certain positions, a liability. None of these threads were ever pulled to their conclusion. The official investigation produced nothing of public record that identified the killers. Cabo Bruno had lived by extrajudicial execution and died by the same. The symmetry of this fact was not lost on Brazil's journalists and commentators, who spent considerable column space in the days following his death examining whether what had happened was justice, revenge, institutional cleanup, or simply the inevitable conclusion of a life built on violence breeding violence. The broader legacy of Floresvaldo de Oliveira, of Cabo Bruno, is a legacy that Brazil continues to live with in ways that are more present than historical. The conditions that created him, that enabled him, that produced communities willing to accept his killings as a form of security. Those conditions did not disappear with his arrest in 1983 or his release in 2012 or his death that September night. The peripheral neighborhoods of São Paulo's south still exist. The tensions between communities and their law enforcement still exist. The history of institutional violence within Brazilian policing still exists. Cabo Bruno was not an aberration that appeared from nowhere and has since been safely contained. He was a product of a system and a reflection of it. He left behind a number that no sentence and no laminated release paper could reduce. 50-plus lives, extinguished in the dark of São Paulo's nights by a man who drove color-changing cars and carried his weapon on his days off, who told himself he was cleaning the streets and left behind only grief and bullet holes and the unbearable question of how many of the people he shot were actually guilty of anything at all. A boy with a cross on his wrist, shot dead, because of a tattoo, because of one man's internal image of what a criminal looked like. That boy had a family. That family had a home, an address in Jabaquara or Jardim Selma or somewhere along the edges of the city where people tried to build lives with what they had. And they woke up one morning without him, and they carried that absence across the years while the man who created it painted pictures in prison, found religion, married, became a pastor, received a favorable psychological assessment, collected his release documents, and began working on a list of 10 dreams. History does not always arrange itself into neat moral lessons. But occasionally it does something close, and on the night of September 26, 2012, in the neighborhood of Quadra Caberta in Pindamonhangaba, with 18 to 20 shots fired by 2 men who were never found, something in the universe appeared to make a correction. Whether that correction was justice is a question each person must answer for themselves. What is not a question, what is simply, verifiably, undeniably true, is that the man who ended more than 50 lives in the shadows of São Paulo ended his own in the same darkness, under the same kind of gunfire he had delivered so many times before. Cabo Bruno killed with 50 bullets and died with 20. There is no greater commentary on his life than that arithmetic. No eulogy, no verdict, just the numbers. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Blonde Who Carried a Rope. This is the story of Benedito Moreira de Carvalho, a.k.a. the Monster of Guaianazes, the Blonde Strangler, the Blonde Monster. There are men who kill out of rage, men who kill out of fear, and then rarer and far more chilling, men who kill the way others breathe, steadily, quietly, without losing a single night of sleep. Picture this: a well-dressed man, suit pressed, hat tilted just right, a briefcase hanging from one hand. He walks the dirt paths of São Paulo's outskirts in 1952, polite, calm, almost distinguished. Neighbors wave at him. Children don't run. Why would they? He looks like someone's father, someone's uncle. He looks, by every measure of ordinary life, completely and devastatingly harmless. But inside that briefcase, tucked neatly, deliberately, patiently, is a rope. A small rope with a loop already tied at one end. And the man carrying it has already done this before, more times than anyone yet knows. His name is Benedito Moreira de Carvalho, and the streets of Greater São Paulo are about to become something no mother, no child, no morning commute would ever fully recover from. He is not a monster by appearance. He is a monster by choice. And that, dear listener, is what makes him the most terrifying kind there is. There is a particular kind of darkness that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with wild eyes and torn clothing. It doesn't snarl at strangers or speak in tongues. It arrives in a clean shirt, with combed hair and a measured smile, and it sits across from you at a dinner table and asks about your day. It borrows sugar from the neighbor and tips its hat to the elderly woman on the corner. It folds its newspaper neatly and crosses its legs and seems, by every reasonable measure, like someone you have absolutely nothing to fear. That was Benedito Moreira de Carvalho. Born on the 10th of August, 1909, in the quiet municipality of Tambo in the northern reaches of São Paulo state, Benedito entered the world through death. His mother, the 12th pregnancy of a family already stretched beyond its seams, did not survive the birth. She died on the very day her youngest son drew his first breath, and the weight of that particular beginning life purchased at the cost of another's life would, in some unfathomable way, shadow everything that followed. He was the 12th child. 12 siblings, one overworked, grief-weathered father, and a household that had no room for gentleness. What Benedito remembered most about his childhood was not warmth. It was the whistle of a leather strap through the air. His father, a man clearly broken by loss and the burden of too many mouths, beat his children with whatever was closest. A broom handle, a leather ring made from armadillo tail hide, a length of braided cord. He beat them on the back, across the legs, and worst of all, across the head. Benedito would later describe the blows to his skull with a kind of detached precision that made psychiatrists lean forward in their chairs. The dizziness afterward, the nausea, the brief moments of blackout where the world went white and silent. He did not hate his father, he said. He loved him and hated him in equal and unresolvable measure. That contradiction, that inability to separate love from pain, would calcify inside him into something poisonous. He grew, and as boys from poor families often did in early 20th century Brazil, he found his way into uniform. Benedito joined the military police of São Paulo state, where he served 9 years as a nurse attached to the fire department. 9 years. Long enough to earn trust, build a reputation, become someone. And yet, somewhere inside those 9 years of service and order and institutional respect, something was already unraveling. He was expelled. The records are thin on detail, but the reason is not a sexual offense. The uniform came off, the career ended, and Benedito drifted. He worked as a carpenter for a while, then as a bricklayer's assistant, then as a mechanic's helper. Short stints, never staying long, never leaving a trace deep enough to matter. The kind of work history that makes investigators groan decades later when they try to reconstruct a life. Patchy, transient, deliberately undocumented. But in 1930, he married. Her name was Marina Reis de Almeida, and by all outward appearances they were an unremarkable, stable couple. They had a son, then a daughter. The neighbors liked Benedito, considered him educated, articulate, a man who held interesting conversations and treated his wife with visible affection. A good husband, they said, a decent man. That assessment would later read like a confession of collective blindness. Because beneath the pressed shirts and the pleasant conversations, Benedito Moreira de Carvalho was coming apart. He sought medical treatment for what he vaguely described as uncontrollable sexual impulses. Urges so insistent, so relentless, that they consumed his waking hours and swallowed his sleep. Treatment, however, cost money. 3,600 cruzeiros, approximately, for proper hospitalization, an amount entirely beyond his reach. So he turned instead to folk healers, traditional remedies, herbal teas brewed according to old prescriptions passed down through generations of rural Brazilian custom. He drank them faithfully. They did nothing. The impulses did not quiet. They sharpened. His wife was ill. Whatever their marital intimacy had once been, it was now gone. He could not satisfy his desires within the boundaries of his home. So he went outside. And in that decision, that deliberate choice to cross a threshold that most human beings instinctively recoil from, Benedito Moreira de Carvalho ceased to be merely a troubled man and became something categorically different. The first recorded offense was the molestation of a minor. He was caught, tried, and sentenced to a year in prison. 1 year. And then he walked out. You would think, perhaps you need to think, for the sake of your own faith in systems and justice, that 1 year in a cell would have recalibrated something. That the shame of exposure, the cold mechanics of incarceration, the weight of a conviction on paper, would have reached whatever was driving him and silenced it. It did not. He stepped back into the world with the same interior architecture intact, the same urges coiled and waiting, and resumed exactly where he had left off. In 1937, there were incidents. Then in 1941, then 1946. The years become a grim drumbeat. Periodic eruptions of violence followed by periods of apparent calm that were never truly calm at all, only suppressed. The psychiatrists who would eventually examine him pieced together this timeline from fragmentary records and Benedito's own admissions, delivered in the sterile language of institutional confession long after the worst of it was done. By 1951, Benedito was awaiting trial on new charges. This time, the seduction of a minor, logged at a jail in Maggie das Cruzes. He was inside. He was supposed to stay inside. But Benedito, it turned out, was not a man easily contained. He escaped, slipped out of the jail's custody and fled to Itacara, where, almost immediately, he resumed his attacks. He went after multiple women in rapid succession. He was caught attempting to assault a Japanese national named Dainiko Taniguchi, apprehended mid-crime, and returned to custody. A habeas corpus secured his release in November of 1951. Within weeks, less than a month, barely enough time for the ink on the paperwork to dry, he attacked again. A young woman named Lydia, in São Bernardo do Campo, on the 21st of December. Christmas was days away. The city was decorated. People were buying gifts. And Benedito Moreira de Carvalho was in the bushes. When he was finally released and relocated to the Guaiana neighborhood of São Paulo the following year, something fundamental had shifted. The attacks that followed were no longer merely assaults. They were not survivable. Benedito had crossed the final line. The one that, once crossed, rearranges everything about who a person is. He had become a killer. His method was calculated and consistent in its brutality. He moved between neighborhoods and satellite cities with the ease of someone who understood geography as a tactical advantage. Greater São Paulo in 1952 was still a patchwork of densely populated urban centers stitched together by long stretches of rural road, scrubland, and farmland where a person could disappear from public view in seconds. He knew this. He exploited it with the fluency of someone who had walked those margins many times before. He always appeared well-dressed. The suit, the hat, the briefcase or leather bag swinging from one hand. He looked respectable. He looked safe. He looked like a man on his way somewhere legitimate, someone with a destination and a purpose and absolutely nothing to hide. Inside the bag was a rope, small, neat, already looped. His victims were overwhelmingly children and young adolescents, unaccompanied, walking roads that felt familiar and therefore falsely safe. Many were of Japanese descent, part of the large Japanese-Brazilian community that had settled in Greater São Paulo over the preceding decades, families who worked farms and small businesses and sent their children out into the world with the reasonable expectation that they would come home. He would approach them. He would speak to them. The nature of what he said, whether it was a greeting, an offer of help, a direct and shocking proposition, varied, but the outcome rarely did. If they tried to run, he ran faster. If they screamed, he moved faster still. His hands found their throats with practiced efficiency, or the rope uncoiled from the bag and did the same work with even less effort. He squeezed until they went limp, until the thrashing stopped, until consciousness drained away and the body beneath his hands went slack and unresisting. And then he dragged them into the trees. Whether they were alive or dead by that point, he did not seem to particularly care. Psychiatrists who studied him later would note this with particular alarm. The absence of any apparent preference between a living victim and a dead one suggested a disorder that exceeded the already harrowing category of sexual violence and entered territory that had its own clinical name, its own specific darkness. He did what he came to do, and when it was finished, he left. He walked back out onto the road. He straightened his hat. He picked up his briefcase. And he walked on. Sometimes, on the same day, he would do it again. There were days when he attacked 5 people between sunrise and sunset. 5. A number so staggering that even the investigators who would eventually piece it together sat back from their desks and had to breathe. 5 attacks in a single day and still, by his own account, not feeling satisfied. Not feeling finished. Something inside Benedito Moreira de Carvalho was a wound that refused to close, that demanded and was never, by any measure, filled. He kept notes. This is the detail that makes the stomach turn in a particular, specific way. Not the violence, not the body count, but the notebook. Small, neat, carried with the same care he applied to his wardrobe. In it, he recorded the names of his victims, their locations, the dates. He had also collected newspaper clippings, articles about other sexual criminals who had been arrested in Sao Paulo. He kept these, he would later explain, because he had no intention of being blamed for crimes he hadn't committed. He was meticulous about attribution. He wanted credit for precisely what was his and nothing more. The careful accounting of a man who believed, on some level, that he was operating within a comprehensible personal logic. He had a wife. He had children. He went home. He sat at the dinner table. He crossed his legs and held his newspaper and asked about the day. The neighbors still thought he was decent. And across Greater Sao Paulo, the families of girls who had not come home were beginning to understand that something was moving through their world. Something that looked like a man but operated like something else entirely. The police were receiving reports. The neighborhoods were whispering. The scrubland at the edges of the city was beginning to give up its terrible secrets. But Benedito Moreira de Carvalho was still walking, still dressed, still carrying his briefcase, still, by every outward appearance, completely and devastatingly harmless. The worst was not yet over. In fact, it had barely begun. February 26, 1952. Mark the date. Press it into your memory like a thumbprint into soft wax. Because this is the day the killing season formally opened. The day Benedito Moreira de Carvalho stopped merely brutalizing and began destroying. Her name was Teresa Panza. 14 years old. She was in Diadema, a district at the southwestern edge of Greater Sao Paulo. Still semi-rural then, dirt roads winding between modest homes, children walking paths that felt known and unthreatening because nothing terrible had yet made them otherwise. Teresa was going about her day. She had no reason to be afraid. She had no reason to look at the well-dressed man on the road with anything but the ordinary disinterest one gives to a passing stranger. She did not survive the encounter. The details of exactly what happened to Teresa Panza in those final moments have the particular weight of things that cannot be fully said. A violence so complete, so one-sided, so utterly contemptuous of her personhood that to narrate it plainly feels almost inadequate. She was 14. She was grabbed. She was strangled into silence. And she was dragged into the vegetation that lined the path, where Benedito did what he had come to do and left her. He walked away. He always walked away. The weeks that followed were quiet in the worst possible sense. The quiet of a predator resting between strikes, recalibrating, watching. Benedito went back to his life in Guyana. He worked his temporary jobs at various sawmills scattered across the city. Always brief assignments, always paid in cash, always leaving before anyone learned his real name or his real address. He wandered. April 7th, 1952. Parelheiros on Sao Paulo's southern fringe. A woman named Gertrude Dunzinger, 29 years old, was making her way home after stepping off a bus. She was a mother of 2. Her day had been ordinary, the kind of day that people reconstruct afterward, in grief and disbelief, searching for the exact moment where ordinary became irreversible. The exact moment was the road between the bus stop and her front door. Benedito was there. He was always there. Wherever the roads were long and the trees were close and the nearest witness was too far away to matter. Gertrude fought. Many of his victims fought, because the instinct to survive is among the most ferocious forces in human biology, and it does not surrender without resistance. But Benedito was practiced. The rope was ready. The outcome was already decided before the struggle began. Gertrude Dunzinger never reached her front door. Her children would grow up without her. And Benedito Moreira de Carvalho walked back down the road with his hat on straight and his briefcase swinging, and the distance between what he was and what the world believed him to be held steady, unbroken. May 26, 1952. A child named Namiko Suetnu, 12 years old, was attacked near the Fazenda de Juda or along the Estrada do Sapopemba. The exact location disputed by records that were incomplete to begin with, a reflection of how stretched and underpowered the investigative apparatus was in the face of crimes spread across multiple jurisdictions. Namiko was 12. She was of Japanese descent, part of the demographic Benedito seemed to deliberately target, whether by preference or by opportunity within the specific neighborhoods he haunted. She did not survive. In June, the pace accelerated in a way that should have triggered citywide panic but instead moved through the system in fragments, each crime logged separately, connected to nothing yet, the thread not yet visible to anyone who might pull it. June 18, 1952. Itaquaquituba. Luisa Marlene dos Santos, 11 years old. A child. 11 years old. The number sits in the sentence and refuses to be comfortable there, as it should. He found her as he found them all. Alone, unguarded, on a path where the trees started close and the nearest adult was nowhere in sight. She was grabbed. She was strangled. She was taken into the vegetation. She was 11 years old and she was not going home. 2 days later, June 20th, 1952, Barueri, a woman known in records as Marina da Silva. The date so close to the previous attack that the geography of the crimes alone should have drawn a line across the map and made the pattern undeniable. But the investigations were fragmented, different municipalities, different precincts, different officers compiling different reports, none yet overlapping into the single terrible picture they collectively formed. He was moving across the city like a weather system, peering here, disappearing there, leaving devastation and moving on before the shock had finished settling. The 21st of July, 1952, Parada 15 de Novembro, in Sao Paulo. Marcilia Oliveira de Souza, 18 years old. On the road, by the trees, the rope, the silence afterward. August 2nd, São Bernardo do Campo. And this is the entry in the record that, even among all the others, carries a particular weight. He attacked 2 people that day, simultaneously, a child named Maria Nishigawa, 11 years old, and a boy, referred to in records only by his initials, JPT, to protect a survivor's identity, who was 8 years old. The youngest known victim of Benedito Moreira de Carvalho, a child so small that the mind instinctively resists the image, pushes back against the reality of it. Maria Nishigawa did not survive. JPT, the 8-year-old boy, somehow did, the only confirmed male victim in Benedito's known history, and a survivor in the most brutal possible sense of the word. The fact that he attacked a boy at all was significant. Benedito had always claimed, even after his arrest, that he was not interested in adult women, that his fixation was specific. But here, in the heat of August on a road in São Bernardo do Campo, something had expanded or abandoned whatever internal targeting mechanism he claimed to operate by, and he took 2 children at once. He left one alive. Not out of mercy. There is no mercy anywhere in this story. More likely, circumstances intervened. A sound. A movement. Something that fractured his concentration and sent him moving. August 21st, 1952. Guarulhos. Mayoko Okuyama, 14 years old. This would be the last murder attributed with certainty to Benedito Moreira de Carvalho, though the true count of everything he did across 15 years of escalating violence almost certainly exceeds what the official record captured. But between February and August of 1952, in a span of less than 6 months, he had killed at minimum 8 women and children across Greater Sao Paulo. He had attacked many more who survived, survivors who carried the experience in their bodies and their memories for the rest of their lives. A secondary layer of damage that the official victim count never fully captures. Now consider the spatial dimension of this. Greater Sao Paulo in 1952 was not a compact geography. These crimes spanned Diadema, Parelheiros, Itaquaquituba, Barueri, São Bernardo do Campo, Guarulhos, a scatter of locations across what is effectively a metropolitan sprawl. Each attack required travel. Each required reconnaissance, however instinctive, of isolated roads and vulnerable moments. Each required him to move unobserved through communities where people should have been able to recognize a recurring threat. They couldn't, because the threat wore a suit and a hat and carried a briefcase and greeted people politely on the road, and nothing about him registered as danger. The Japanese-Brazilian community bore a disproportionate portion of the grief. Multiple victims, Namiko Suetnu, Maria Nishigawa, Mayoko Okuyama, were of Japanese descent, and the neighborhoods where Benedito operated had high concentrations of this community. Families who had emigrated to Brazil seeking farmland and possibility were now burying their children in its soil under circumstances no migration story accounts for. The terror was specific and communal, and it settled into the Japanese-Brazilian neighborhoods of Greater São Paulo with a particular intimacy that outlasted the criminal himself. And still the man in the suit walked the roads. There was a detail discovered later that no investigative file could fully process without a moment of stillness. His briefcase, the one he carried with apparent professional purpose, contained, in addition to the small rope with its pre-tied loop, newspaper clippings. Dozens of them. Articles about other sexual criminals. Other predators arrested in São Paulo. He read these articles with interest. He kept them carefully. He had sorted them. His explanation, when it came, was disarmingly organized. He had no interest in being blamed for someone else's crimes. He was maintaining a record, an alibi by proxy. If he was ever arrested, he could point to the clippings and establish, at least in his own accounting, which crimes were legitimately his and which belonged to others. He was not delusional. He was not operating in a haze of psychosis where reality had dissolved into something unrecognizable. He understood cause. He understood consequence. He understood enough about evidence and attribution to maintain a personal archive against the possibility of wrongful accusation. What this meant, the implication that settled over investigators and psychiatrists like cold water, was that Benedito Moreira de Carvalho knew exactly what he was doing. He knew it was something to be documented, defended against, protected from misattribution. He was not lost in unreality. He was present, lucid, and choosing. The insanity defense that would eventually keep him from formal criminal trial was, in the strict clinical sense, based on mental abnormality, a psychiatric evaluation that determined he could not meaningfully stand trial. But the meticulous notebook, the clipping archive, the careful management of his own paper trail spoke to a man who understood precisely the weight of what he was carrying. He simply did not care. Remorse is a human function. It requires the recognition that another person's pain matters, that their suffering is real and significant and creates an obligation in the person who caused it. Benedito experienced none of this. When he was finally arrested and confronted with the full catalog of what he had done, he acknowledged it without apparent distress. He admitted to the attacks involving children with the same tone one might use to confirm a work schedule. He had done these things, yes. He had not done certain other things. He wanted that distinction clearly recorded. The distinction he cared about most was not moral. It was administrative. By the time August of 1952 gave way to the swelling heat of a city that had begun to understand it was hunting something it could not yet see clearly, Benedito Moreira de Carvalho had already committed what would become his final murder. He did not know it was his last. He had no reason to think the road had narrowed. He was still walking, still dressed, still moving between sawmills and neighborhoods and isolated paths with practiced, patient ease. But the net, slow, imperfect, stretched thin across too many jurisdictions, was finally beginning to close. The investigation into the killings across Greater São Paulo in 1952 was, by every modern forensic standard, desperately under-equipped. There was no DNA, no fiber analysis, no digital footprint, no centralized criminal database cross-referencing offenses across municipal boundaries. What the investigators had was paper, handwritten reports, physical descriptions from traumatized survivors, the slow accumulation of geographic patterns visible only when someone was willing to lay every report side by side and stare at the map until the map began to speak. Eventually, someone did. A team was assembled. Not a glamorous task force with specialized training and dedicated resources, but a gathering of investigators determined enough to push past the jurisdictional fragmentation that had allowed the crimes to continue for as long as they had. They began methodically. They returned to the survivors. They returned to the witnesses who had been present in the vicinity of various attacks. Neighbors, passers-by, people who had seen a man on a road and thought nothing of him at the time. The descriptions were consistent in their fundamentals. Well-dressed, light-skinned, hat, bag or briefcase, a manner that inspired no immediate alarm, which was itself a description, a data point, a kind of profile built not from what was threatening but from what was carefully not threatening. And then something happened that is, depending on your perspective, either darkly comic or a precise illustration of how ordinary evil can be. One of the surviving victims, asked to describe her attacker, produced a description that bore striking resemblance to one of the investigators on the very team pursuing the case. His name was Adalberto Kurt. Another witness independently offered a similar impression. The investigators were startled and then pragmatic. They set aside whatever awkwardness that moment carried and used it as a navigational tool. If the perpetrator resembled Kurt, in physical type, in coloring, in the cultivated appearance of respectability, then the search should focus on men who matched that profile and had known criminal histories of sexual offenses. They went to the records. Sao Paulo's police archives in 1952 were not elegantly organized, but they existed. The investigators combed through documentation of prior sexual offenders, men who had been arrested, processed, convicted, or simply noted in police logs over the preceding decades. They were looking for someone who looked like a certain kind of respectable man, who had a documented history of sexual crimes against minors, and who might plausibly be moving between the neighborhoods where the attacks had occurred. The name Benedito Moreira de Carvalho surfaced. He had a prior conviction for molestation. He had escaped custody in 1951 and been recaptured mid-assault. He had a history that was, in retrospect, a written confession spread across 2 decades of police paperwork, each entry a warning that the system had received and not acted upon with sufficient force. The investigators cross-referenced his file against employment records. Benedito had been working at various sawmills, temporary positions, cash wages, no contracts. But temporary employment leaves a residue, a name on a hiring ledger, a date of first appearance, a date of last appearance. When the investigators matched those dates against the dates of known attacks, the correlation was not subtle. He had not reported to work on days when crimes occurred. The absences lined up with the crimes like measurements against a ruler. He had, apparently, given a false address to his employers. That was consistent. He was careful enough to obscure his actual location from those who might report it. But careful is not invisible. The investigators identified his real address in Guyana through the kind of painstaking cross-referencing that consumes weeks and rewards patience. They did not rush in. They installed a mechanism at his residence, an alert system, described variously in the historical record as a bell connected to his door, to notify them the moment he returned home. They positioned surveillance. They waited with the particular controlled tension of people who believe they have found the right person and cannot afford to be wrong. August 29, 1952. Benedito Moreira de Carvalho came home. He was apprehended without incident. This is the detail that always requires a pause without incident. No dramatic confrontation, no fleeing, no violence at the moment of capture. He came through the door and the investigators were there, and he was taken, quietly, as though the whole catastrophic architecture of what he had done settled around him without ceremony. And he accepted it with the same flat effect that characterized everything else about how he processed the world's reactions to his actions. The search of his home was immediate and thorough. What they found was a document of itself. Not a home containing nothing unusual, but a home containing everything. The notebook was there. The list of victims and attacks, maintained with the organizational habits of someone who treats their own crimes as a personal archive worth preserving. The locations, the dates, the numbers cross-referenced and careful. There were stolen items, school bags, the bags of children, taken as what, trophies? Souvenirs? The word souvenir feels obscenely insufficient for what these objects represented. each one belonging to a child who had been carrying it when the last ordinary moment of their life ended. One of the bags contained the rope. Small, neat, the loop already tied, exactly as described by survivors. And there were the newspaper clippings, dozens and dozens of them, folded and sorted, a personal archive of sexual crimes committed by others in Sao Paulo. Maintained, as Benedito would explain, to protect him from being falsely accused of crimes that were not his. He had done the things he had done. He would not accept responsibility for things he hadn't. The logic was internally coherent and externally monstrous. When investigators interviewed him, Benedito was cooperative in the particular way that suggests someone who has already decided what they will and will not admit to. He acknowledged the attacks on children. He was specific. Yes, these were his. He denied involvement in the attack on Lydia da Silva, an older woman, because he claimed no interest in adult women. He was drawing lines, maintaining categories. His confession was curated. The arrest sent a shock through Sao Paulo that the city was not entirely prepared for. Serial predation at this scale, across multiple municipalities, across a span of months that had paralyzed communities, was outside the framework of most people's experience of crime. The police reinvestigated historical cases. Unsolved attacks from prior years were re-examined in light of what was now known about Benedito's patterns, his geography, his methods. Several men were exonerated. Men who had been serving prison sentences for attacks they had not committed, whose convictions had been built on the thinnest of evidence in a system that needed a name to attach to an offense, walked out of cells when the investigation established that the crimes attributed to them were, in fact, Benedito's. The relief of exoneration arrived inside the recognition that years of innocent imprisonment had already been served. The math of that particular injustice does not resolve into anything comfortable. Benedito underwent psychiatric evaluation. The board of psychiatrists who assessed him produced a finding that would determine the rest of his legal life. He was not fit to stand trial. His mental abnormalities, the full clinical picture of his disorder, his apparent absence of impulse control in the domain of his compulsions, his flat effect regarding consequence and victims, placed him outside the reach of criminal trial in the conventional sense. He could not, the psychiatrists determined, meaningfully participate in or comprehend the formal legal proceedings against him. He was not convicted of murder, not formally, not with a sentence attached. He was instead committed, interned at the Franco de Rocha Psychiatric Hospital, a facility for the criminally insane outside Sao Paulo, where he would remain for the rest of his life. For 25 years, the city moved on as cities do. Sao Paulo grew, exploded really in the post-war decades from a large city into a megacity, swallowing its own outskirts, paving over the scrubland where girls had been dragged into the trees, building apartment blocks and factories and highways across the geography of a crimes that most new residents would never know had happened there. But in Franco de Rocha, in the locked wards of the psychiatric institution, Benedito Moreira de Carvalho was still alive, still eating, still sleeping, still waking up each morning in a body that had done what it had done and experienced no particular distress about it. He had outsmarted the rope in a sense. Not the small rope in his briefcase. He had used that expertly, fatally, for years, but the figurative rope, the gallows that might otherwise have ended him. The psychiatric finding had placed him beyond formal punishment, and so he lived in institutional care, fed and housed by the state whose children he had destroyed. This is the part of the story that certain people find more disturbing than the killings themselves. Not because psychiatric evaluation is wrong, or because the clinicians who found him unfit were mistaken, but because the distance between what he was and what the law could formally do with him was a chasm, and into that chasm fell something that the families of his victims needed and never fully received. Justice, or at least the performance of justice. The ritual acknowledgement in formal legal space that what happened to their daughters and sisters had a weight the state recognized. That acknowledgement never came. Not in a courtroom, not with a verdict, not with a sentence that could be measured against the measure of what was done. There is an ending to every story that begins with a killer, though it rarely arrives in the shape that justice demands. Sometimes it arrives in a courtroom, with a sentence handed down while cameras flash and families weep, and the legal system performs its formal accounting of what one human being did to others. Sometimes it arrives on a battlefield of evidence and defense, the entire machinery of criminal law grinding through years of testimony before it reaches a verdict that feels, imperfectly, incompletely, like resolution. For the families of Benedito Moreira de Carvalho's victims, the ending arrived in none of these shapes. It arrived instead in an institution, in a locked ward, in the antiseptic routines of psychiatric confinement, meals at appointed hours, medication schedules, supervised movement within designated spaces, a life stripped of consequence in the most precise possible sense. No trial, no formal conviction for murder, no sentence commensurate with the deaths of 11 people. Or more, if the suspected crimes that extended across 15 years were fully counted, or the surviving trauma of the 18 confirmed rape victims, or the families who lived the remainder of their lives shaped by loss that the state had never formally named. Benedito Moreira de Carvalho lived in the Franco de Rocha Psychiatric Hospital from 1952 until October 8, 1977. 25 years. He died of a heart attack in the facility's cafeteria. An ordinary moment in an institutional day, the kind of death that carries no particular drama, no poetic weight, no final reckoning. He collapsed over a meal, and that was it. He was 68 years old. The children he killed were forever the ages at which he found them. Teresa Panza, 14. Namiko Suetnu, 12. Luisa Marlene dos Santos, 11. Maria Nishigawa, 11. Mayoko Okuyama, 14. Gertrude Dunzinger, 29. A mother who never came home from a bus stop. Marcilia Oliveira de Souza, 18. The others whose records are thin or missing, who exist in the historical account only as an approximation of a name and an age and a location where something ended that should have continued. They never grew older. He did. The psychiatric evaluation that kept him from formal trial has been examined and re-examined by legal scholars and criminologists in the decades since. The finding of unfitness was not fabricated. By all contemporary accounts, the Board of Psychiatrists operated in good faith within the clinical framework available to them in 1952. The disordered compulsions Benedito exhibited, the apparent absence of conventional effect, the patterns of behavior that suggested something beyond simple criminality, these were real clinical observations that fit the criteria then applicable. But the notebook persists as a counter-argument. Not legally, not as a technical matter of competency assessment, but morally in the register where ordinary people process what happened. A man who maintains a personal archive of his victims to protect himself from false attribution is a man who understands that what he is doing is categorizable, is documentable, is the kind of thing that, if wrongly attributed, constitutes an injustice he does not wish to suffer. He was protecting himself from injustice while perpetrating it. That recognition is not a legal argument. It is something worse. It is the awareness that intelligence and deliberateness were present in every act he committed, and that the clinical findings of abnormality existed alongside a functional understanding of cause and consequence that should, by any human reckoning, have obligated different choices. He made the choices he made, 29 times, according to the most thorough accounting of his crimes. 10 rapes followed by murder, 9 rapes alone, 1 serious assault, 6 attempted rapes, 1 attempted rape with attempted murder, 1 murder without sexual assault. 29 documented criminal acts across 15 years. The arithmetic of it is staggering even before the human weight is applied. The human weight. Mothers who waited at doors that daughters never came through. Fathers who walked roads looking for a child who had already been dragged off the edge of the world. Siblings who grew up with an absence at the table where a sister used to sit. The boy, JPT, 8 years old at the time of the attack in São Bernardo do Campo, who survived and carried forward the particular burden of having survived, of knowing what had happened and living inside the knowledge of it for the rest of his life. The Japanese-Brazilian community, which had already endured the specific displacements of war and immigration and discrimination, absorbed the loss of multiple daughters with a communal grief that history has largely failed to document with the depth it deserved. These were families who had come to Brazil carrying ambitions of stability and belonging, who had built farms and businesses and neighborhoods, who sent their children to school along roads that they had not yet learned to fear. After 1952, those roads were different. The memory of what moved along them did not dissipate with the arrest. Settled. One of the most significant figures in the subsequent reckoning with Benedito's crimes was not a detective or a prosecutor but a writer. Ilana Kassowy, a Brazilian jurist and criminologist who authored one of the definitive texts on Brazilian serial killers, Made in Brazil, documented Benedito's crimes with clinical precision and unflinching detail that the popular press of his era had often softened or fragmented. Her account established Benedito Moreira de Carvalho within the formal taxonomy of Brazilian criminal history as the most prolific serial killer of the 1950s, a designation that carries both the weight of historical record and the discomfort of being a ranking applied to a category of human behavior that should not have enough members to constitute a ranking at all. She described his method, the grab, the mouth covered, the strangling into unconsciousness, the dragging into the trees, in language that restored to the acts their actual texture. This mattered, because one of the consistent failures of how society processes mass violence is the tendency to abstract it, to let the numbers stand in for the individuals, to let the clinical language of criminology stand in for the physical reality of what was done to specific people in specific moments that were the last moments of their lives. Teresa Panza was not a statistic. She was a 14-year-old girl on a road in Diadema on the 26th of February in 1952, and the last thing she experienced was a man's hands around her throat in a place where no one could hear what was happening to her. That specificity, that insistence on the reality of the individual over the abstraction of the aggregate, is what serious true crime documentation owes to the people it discusses. The investigation that caught Benedito also produced, as a secondary outcome, one of the more haunting episodes in Brazilian criminal justice history: the exoneration of men who had been imprisoned for his crimes. These were men, unnamed in the public record, their cases reconstructed after the fact from closed files, who had been convicted in the absence of evidence strong enough to mean much, in a system that needed accountability attached to unsolved violence and found it in whoever was available. When Benedito was arrested and the scope of his crimes was established, investigators looked backward. They found the discrepancies. They found the convictions built on misattribution. And they found men who had served time in cells for things they had not done, while the man who had done them walked the roads of Sao Paulo in a hat and a suit with a rope in his briefcase. This is the detail that reveals something about justice as an institution rather than justice as a concept. The institution, in this case, had been wrong. It had compensated for its wrongness by correcting the record. The men were released, but the years they served did not come back. That time had been consumed, and no exoneration reaches backward in time to return it. The Franco de Rocha Psychiatric Hospital, where Benedito spent his final 25 years, was not a place of comfort by any modern standard. It was an institution of its era, crowded, underfunded, offering the bare architecture of medical containment without anything resembling therapeutic healing. He lived there among others similarly designated by the legal system, in conditions that were themselves subject to criticism and eventual reform in the decades that followed. Whether he suffered there is a question that the historical record does not answer, partly because no one was particularly interested in asking it, and partly because the answer, whatever it was, would not have satisfied anything that needed satisfying. What is certain is that he maintained, until the end, the flat equanimity that had characterized his confessions. He was not tormented by what he had done. He was not visited at night by the faces of the children he had killed. If he was, he gave no sign of it that anyone recorded. He ate, he slept, he occupied space, and on October 8, 1977, while eating in the institution's cafeteria, his heart stopped. No one wrote a detailed account of his final day. No one described his last meal, or whether he sat alone or at a table with others, or whether he looked out a window before his heart gave out, or what he was thinking about in the last seconds before the biology of him ceased, and the account of Benedito Moreira de Carvalho concluded in an ordinary room with institutional lighting and the sounds of other people eating around him. He died the way many people die, in the middle of something mundane, without ceremony, without a final scene proportionate to what his life had contained. His victims did not get that. They did not get the quiet death in a warm room. They got what he chose to give them. A sudden and overwhelming darkness at the end of a road, hands at the throat, the sound of trees, and then nothing. At 11, at 12, 14, at 18, at 29, the city of Sao Paulo grew over the years. The scrubland where bodies were found was eventually swallowed by expansion. Roads paved, buildings raised. The geography of a specific and terrible history absorbed into the texture of an urban landscape that no longer bore visible marks of what had happened there. The children are remembered now primarily by researchers and crime historians and the families who cannot forget what cities eventually do, which is to move forward, which is to build over, which is to grow without particular regard for the specific violence that occurred in a specific patch of earth at a specific moment decades ago. But certain things resist erasure. The notebook resists erasure, that small, careful document in which a man wrote the names of the people he had destroyed as though they were inventory, as though their lives were items to be accounted for in a ledger of his own making. It is the most clarifying artifact of what Benedito Moreira de Carvalho actually was. Not a creature beyond comprehension, not a force of nature, not an insanity that descended from outside, but a man who understood enough to keep records, who possessed enough deliberate intelligence to maintain an archive, who chose, in the deepest and most unambiguous sense of the word, to do every single thing he did. The newspaper clippings resist erasure. The collection of articles about other predators, sorted and saved to protect him from blame, the product of a mind that understood systems of attribution and took active steps to manage them. This was not confusion. This was strategy. And the survivors resist erasure, the ones whose names appear in records as people who escaped, who fought back hard enough, who were interrupted by chance, who lived to describe what had come for them on those isolated roads. Maria de Lourdes Silva, 19 years old when she was attacked in Guarulhos, who later served as a key witness in identifying Benedito to investigators. JPT, the 8-year-old boy who should never have encountered anything like what he encountered, who survived an attack that killed the 11-year-old girl beside him. Their survival is not a triumph. Survival of this kind is not triumph. It is just the continuation of breathing with additional weight. But it is a testament to something that Benedito never managed to fully extinguish, the refusal to be erased. The monster of Guayaneses, the blonde strangler, the blonde monster. 3 names for one man, none of them adequate. Monsters, in the tradition of the word, are creatures from outside the human, fantastical, recognizable by their difference, safely categorized as other. Benedito Moreira de Carvalho was not other. He was a husband, a father, a neighbor, a man who held interesting conversations and was considered decent and kept his hat on straight and walked out the door every morning into a city that had no reason yet to be afraid of him. He was the most frightening kind of monster there is, the kind that looks exactly like you, the kind that was always already among us. He is gone now, has been for nearly 50 years, gone to whatever silence exists after the biology of a person ceases. But the children he took are also still gone. Still the ages they were, still on the roads where he found them. And somewhere, in the archived records of a Sao Paulo police precinct, in the pages of a criminologist's book, in the family memories of communities that do not forget what was done to their daughters, Benedito Moreira de Carvalho is still walking, still dressed, still carrying the briefcase, still, to anyone who didn't know what to look for, harmless. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Cantarera Maniac. This is the story of Ademir Oliveira Rosario, a.k.a. the silent predator of Serra de Cantarera. He could not speak a single word, but his victims screamed enough for both of them. Deep inside the green throat of one of the largest urban forests on the face of this earth, where the trees grow so tall and so dense that sunlight forgets to reach the ground, a man was hunting. He moved without sound, not because he was careful, not because he was trained, but because silence was the only language he had ever known. Born into a world where his own voice was locked away from him, he had learned, over the years, to communicate in a far more terrifying dialect, one written in blood, one spoken through a blade, one understood only by the people unfortunate enough to cross his path on those dark mountain trails. His name was Ademir Oliveira Rosario, and the forest he stalked, the Serra de Cantareira, a mountain range draped over the northern edge of São Paulo, Brazil, was not just his hunting ground. It was his cathedral, his kingdom, the one place on earth where a man who could not speak, could not be heard screaming, and could not be reasoned with, felt entirely and completely at home. What he did inside that forest shook one of the world's largest cities to its foundation, exposed catastrophic failures in Brazil's mental health system, and left two families with a grief so vast and so permanent that no sentence, no verdict, no number of years behind bars could ever begin to fill the space that was carved out of them. This is the true story of the man they called the Cantareira Maniac, a predator who wore insanity like a mask when it suited him, slipped through the cracks of a broken system not once but repeatedly, and who turned the trails of a beloved nature reserve into a graveyard. Pull up a chair, lower the lights, because once this story begins, it does not stop, and neither did he. There is a version of this story that people want to believe. The comfortable version, the one where the monster was always obviously monstrous, where everyone around him could see the darkness coming from miles away and simply failed to act. That version is clean. It has clear villains and clear warnings and a satisfying, if terrible, logic to it. But the true story of Ademir Oliveira Rosario is far more unsettling than that, because for the first portion of his life, he appeared, at least on the surface, to be something far closer to ordinary than anyone would later dare to admit. He was born in 1971 in the city of São Paulo, a concrete jungle of more than 12 million souls, a city so vast that entire communities exist within it that never cross paths with each other, entire worlds layered on top of worlds, rich and poor and everything in between stacked like geological formations. Into this city, into a family of 7 other siblings, came Ademir Oliveira Rosario, born deaf and mute. From his very first breath, the world of sound was sealed off from him. He could not hear his mother's voice. He could not hear the noise of the city he was born into. He would grow up navigating a São Paulo that was, in the most literal and absolute sense, silent. His family, by most accounts, functioned. His childhood was described by those who knew the household as reportedly normal, a crowded, working-class existence in a sprawling city, nothing particularly remarkable about it. He was one of many children, and while his deafness undoubtedly shaped his experience of the world in profound ways, it did not, according to his relatives, make him initially dangerous or obviously disturbed. He attended school. He moved through the early chapters of his life in the way that children in his circumstances often did, adapting, navigating, surviving. But then adolescence arrived. And adolescence, for Ademir Oliveira Rosario, was the door through which something else walked in. According to one of his sisters, who would later speak to investigators, he began exhibiting what she could only describe as unstable and bizarre behavior as a teenager. She was careful to note that he did not, at that point, cause any major disruptions to the family. He was not violent toward them. He was not destructive in the ways that might have drawn immediate intervention. But there was something in him that had shifted, something in the way he looked at things, the way he moved through spaces, the things that seemed to hold his attention, that did not sit right with the people who knew him best. The kind of wrongness that is easy to dismiss in a young man, easy to rationalize as a phase, easy to absorb into the background noise of a busy family's daily life. The kind of wrongness that, in retrospect, is absolutely unmistakable. No intervention came. No evaluation was sought. The family adapted to the version of Ademir they were presented with, and life continued. By the time the 1990s arrived, Ademir Oliveira Rosario had crossed into a different kind of territory entirely. In 1990, he was convicted of theft. It was his first entry into the criminal record that would eventually define the public's understanding of who he was. Not a dramatic beginning, not a violent one, but a beginning nonetheless. A line was crossed. File was opened. A name was written into a ledger that would grow more horrifying with each passing year. The following year, 1991, the nature of what Ademir Oliveira Rosario was capable of became undeniable. He killed a man. The circumstances were described as a dispute, a confrontation of some kind that escalated beyond the point of no return, ending with a man dead and Ademir standing on the other side of that death. He was brought before the courts, and the question of his mental state was placed before the legal system. The verdict, when it came, was acquittal on the grounds of insanity. Rather than prison, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital in the city of Taubaté, roughly 150 kilometers from São Paulo, to receive treatment and to be housed under the supervision of medical professionals who were, in theory, equipped to manage a man of his particular danger level. Here is where the story of Ademir Oliveira Rosario stops being solely the story of one man's violence and begins to become something larger and, in many ways, more damning. Because what happened inside that psychiatric system, the decisions made, the assessments ignored, the doors left unlocked, is as much a part of this story as anything Ademir himself did. Inside the hospital in Taubaté, Ademir was evaluated. Professionals examined him. Tests were conducted. Observations were made. And the conclusion reached by the medical establishment was not a gentle or ambiguous one. Ademir Oliveira Rosario was diagnosed as a dangerous sexual predator. Let that sit for a moment. Not a man with manageable issues. Not a patient whose risks were unclear or whose behavior might be modified with the right treatment and the right environment. A dangerous sexual predator. The diagnosis was explicit. The danger was named. The classification was on record, accessible to anyone within the system who needed to consult it. And then, despite that diagnosis, he was lodged into a semi-open regime. A semi-open regime meaning that Ademir Oliveira Rosario, a man who had killed, a man who had been formally identified as a dangerous sexual predator, was operating under a framework that allowed him to go outside, to leave the grounds of the facility, to exist at intervals in the world beyond those hospital walls, among ordinary people who had no idea who was walking among them. The year was somewhere in the mid to late 1990s. The city of São Paulo had no idea. In 1998, the consequences of that decision arrived with brutal clarity. During one of his authorized outings, one of those moments when the system had decided it was acceptable for this particular man to be at liberty in the outside world, Ademir Oliveira Rosario attacked 2 boys. He did not stop there. He also committed a robbery during the same excursion, demonstrating in the space of a single outing that the threat he posed was neither contained nor diminishing. He was apprehended. He was returned to the hospital, and no stricter regime was imposed on him. Read that sentence again, and let the weight of it settle somewhere deep in your chest, because it is one of the most consequential sentences in this entire story. A man diagnosed as a dangerous sexual predator, operating under a regime that already allowed him outside access, attacked children during one of those outside excursions, and was returned to the hospital under the same conditions that had allowed the attack to happen in the first place. The institution did not escalate. The system did not tighten. The doors did not close. In the early 2000s, Ademir Oliveira Rosario was transferred. He moved from the psychiatric hospital in Taubaté to a different institution, the psychiatric hospital in Franco da Rocha, a city situated on the northwestern edge of Greater São Paulo. Franco da Rocha had a long and complicated history of its own in relation to Brazil's mental health infrastructure, but that complexity is, in many ways, beside the point. What matters is that Ademir arrived there, was assessed there, continued to be housed there, and was eventually cleared for release. On November 25, 2006, the door of the Franco da Rocha Psychiatric Hospital opened, and Ademir Oliveira Rosario walked through it and back into the world. He was not released because he was cured. He was not released because multiple independent evaluations had determined he was no longer a threat. He was released on probation, a conditional freedom granted by a system that was, at least in theory, supposed to maintain oversight of where he went and what he did. The investigations that followed his eventual arrest would reveal that the Franco da Rocha hospital itself was riddled with institutional failures at the time. Understaffing so severe that proper supervision was essentially impossible, inadequate storage of medication for patients, gaps in record-keeping, and an environment in which the kind of careful, consistent monitoring that a man of Adamir's profile desperately required was, functionally, not happening. But that investigation would come later. In November 2006, none of that was publicly known. What happened after Adamir walked out of that hospital, the relationships he formed, the places he went, the life he constructed in the shadow of his release, set the stage for what was coming with a terrible, inexorable precision. He moved back to Sao Paulo. He entered a relationship with a man named Elson Jose Mesagi, a practitioner of candomblé, a pai de santo, as such figures are known in Brazilian religious tradition. Mesagi was not an innocent figure in this story. He had been living with HIV since 1997 and, according to investigators who would later examine both men's behaviors in detail, shared with Adamir a particular and deeply disturbing attraction. Both men were drawn to teenagers between the ages of 14 and 15. Both men, in different but overlapping ways, were predators who had identified a particular type of victim. Mesagi had his own methods. He would approach young teenagers and lure them toward forested areas with offers of candy, soft drinks, the small, trivial inducements that can seem harmless to a kid who has not yet learned to read the danger signs properly. Together, these two men moved through Sao Paulo with intentions that were catastrophic for anyone who encountered them. But it was Adamir who took things to the edge that the other man either could not or would not approach. By March of 2007, just 4 months after his release from the psychiatric hospital, Adamir Oliveira Rosario had identified his hunting ground, the Serra de Cantareira. Stretching across the northern periphery of Sao Paulo, the Serra de Cantareira is, on its face, a place of extraordinary natural beauty. It is one of the largest urban forests anywhere in the world. A vast, green, breathing reserve of Atlantic forest, home to hundreds of species of wildlife, threaded with hiking trails, beloved by Sao Paulo residents who needed respite from the concrete and noise of the city pressing in on all sides. Families hiked there, couples walked there, children played on its trails. It was, in the collective imagination of the city, a sanctuary. Adamir saw it differently. He saw isolation. He saw trails that wound through dense forest where screams, if they came, would be absorbed by the trees before reaching anyone. He saw the particular vulnerability of teenagers who came to those trails in small groups, sometimes alone, moving through a space that felt safe because it had always been presented as safe. He saw opportunity in every unaccompanied young man who rounded a corner of those trails and found himself, suddenly and without warning, face to face with Adamir Oliveira Rosario. From March 2007 onward, he began to work those trails with a methodical, predatory patience that is as chilling as it is difficult to comprehend. He was not erratic. He was not random. He was purposeful. He would position himself along the paths, watching, evaluating, waiting for the moment when a target was isolated enough, when no adults were nearby, when the geography of the trail offered him enough cover to act. He carried a knife. When the right moment came, he used it as a tool of terror, pressing it against his victims, forcing them into submission, demanding compliance under the threat of death, and committing acts of sexual violence that left his survivors with wounds that went far deeper than anything physical. He is believed to have attacked approximately 21 victims in this manner between March and September 2007. 21 people, mostly male teenagers, who went to the forest and came out broken, terrified, and carrying something dark and permanent with them. 21 people who, in many cases, would not fully understand what they had survived until the full picture of who they had survived it from became public knowledge. He acted largely alone during these attacks. The forest covered his movements. The silence that had defined his entire life now became his greatest weapon. A man who made no noise, who could not shout or call out himself, who moved through those trails with the eerie, effortless quiet of something that had been raised in silence and had learned to weaponize it. For 6 months, the trails of the Serra de Cantareira belonged to him. And then September came. There are days that exist before a crime and days that exist after it, and the dividing line between those two categories of time is razor sharp. For the families of Francisco de Oliveira Neto and Josenildo José de Oliveira, That line falls on September 22, 2007. A day that began with the most ordinary of errands and ended in the kind of darkness that no family should ever have to enter. Francisco was 14 years old. Josenildo was 13. They were brothers, born from the same mother, raised in the same house in the neighborhood known as Jardim Parana, a working-class community on the fringes of Sao Paulo, one of hundreds of neighborhoods that press against each other in that enormous, sprawling city, where people live close together and know each other, and where children often move through their immediate surroundings with a freedom born of familiarity and trust. Jardim Parana was not far from the forest. The forest was, for people in neighborhoods like this one, not a distant luxury but a local feature. Something nearby, something accessible, something that ordinary kids from ordinary families visited without a second thought. On September 22nd, Francisco and Josenildo's mother asked them to go into the nearby woods to collect some fruits. It was not an unusual request. It was the kind of errand that children in neighborhoods adjacent to forests had been completing for generations. Straightforward, brief, familiar. The boys headed out. They did not come back. Their mother waited. Hours passed and the waiting became something else. A tightening in the chest, a heaviness behind the eyes, the terrible premonition that something had shifted in the structure of the world. When it became clear that her sons were not coming home on their own, she contacted the police. A search and rescue operation was launched into the forest. For 3 days they searched. On September 25, 2007, 3 days after Francisco and Josenildo had walked into the forest to pick fruit for their mother, their bodies were found. Both of them, naked, lying in the forest in northern Sao Paulo, in the green shadow of the Serra de Cantareira that had held them since the day they disappeared. The initial reaction from investigators included the suggestion, tentative, offered as one possibility among several, that the boys might have become lost and died as a result of an accident. It was the kind of explanation that the human mind reaches for when confronted with horror, the one that does not require you to think about what a human being had done to 2 children in the dark of a forest. But that explanation did not survive the evidence. A closer examination of the bodies revealed the truth with blunt, unambiguous clarity. Both Francisco and Josenildo had been stabbed. The coroners identified puncture wounds from a sharp object on both bodies, wounds inflicted deliberately, wounds that spoke to violence of a kind that no accident could produce. The evidence also pointed toward the possibility that both boys had been sexually assaulted before they were killed, adding another layer of horror to what was already almost unbearable. This was no accident. This was murder, and not just murder. It was the murder of 2 children who had gone into the forest to do something for their mother and had encountered something that should never have been free to encounter anyone. The investigation pivoted immediately. Homicide detectives took over, and as they began to pull at the threads of what had happened in that forest, the picture that assembled itself was one that should have been impossible. Should have been because every safeguard that was supposed to prevent it had either failed or never properly existed in the first place. The detectives quickly learned something that sharpened the investigation considerably. Just 1 day before the brothers' disappearance, on September 21, 2007, another group of 3 boys had been attacked in that same area of the forest. 3 teenagers who had been on those trails had encountered a man, and that encounter had turned violent. Unlike Francisco and Josenildo, these 3 boys had managed to escape. They survived, and because they survived, they could describe what they had seen. The man who had attacked them, they told investigators, was young. He was black with a shaved head, and he had a scar on his face. The detail that struck the detectives hardest, the detail that would prove decisive in identifying the suspect, was this. The boys believed their attacker was deaf and mute. They had interacted with him, and in that interaction, something had made it clear that this was not a man who could hear or speak in the conventional sense. The description was narrow enough to be actionable. Investigators began following the thread. It led them, through a series of inquiries that moved with the urgency that only a double murder of children can produce, to a brother of Ademir Oliveira Rosario. When they found him and spoke to him, he told them something that, on its face, should have eliminated Ademir as a suspect. Ademir, his brother explained, was currently incarcerated at a psychiatric hospital for a violent, indecent assault. A man in a psychiatric hospital cannot be on a forest trail in Sao Paulo. A man locked up cannot be attacking teenagers. The information logically pointed away from Ademir, but the investigators did not stop there. They pulled records. They examined the conditions of Ademir's confinement at the Franco de Rocha hospital. And what they discovered unraveled the entire sense of relief that his brother's statement might have provided. Ademir was at the hospital, yes, but the hospital had been allowing him probationary weekend leave. He was not continuously confined. He was not under constant supervision. He had been permitted, repeatedly and systematically, to leave the institution and spend time in the outside world. The same outside world where the Serra de Cantareira waited with its dense trails and its isolated paths and its terrible potential. The investigators showed photographs of Ademir to the 3 boys who had survived the September 21st attack. All 3 identified him immediately and without hesitation. He was their attacker. He was the man with the shaved head and the scar. He was the deaf-mute predator who had come at them with a knife in the forest, who had only failed to kill them because something, luck, speed, numbers, some combination of factors that existed in their favor on that particular day, had allowed them to get away. Ademir Oliveira Rosario was arrested on September 29, 2007, 7 days after Francisco and Josenildo walked into the forest. For days after their naked, stabbed bodies were found among the trees. When investigators confronted him, Ademir did not deny involvement. He admitted responsibility, but with a particular calculated precision that was itself a form of manipulation. He said he had blacked out. He said he could not fully remember what had happened. He acknowledged, through the limited means of communication available to him, that he remembered stabbing Josenildo, the younger of the 2 brothers, the 13-year-old who had gone to the forest to help his mother. He recalled that killing. He retained that memory, but he denied killing Francisco. That death, Ademir said, was not his work. He pointed a finger at Elson Jose Mesagi, the Paida Santo, the man he lived with, the man he had been connected to since his release from the hospital. Mesagi, Ademir claimed, was the one who had killed the older boy. Mesagi had been in that forest too, Ademir insisted, and it was Mesagi's hands that had taken Francisco's life. Mesagi was detained. He denied everything. He denied being in the forest. He denied involvement in either death. He professed his innocence with the force of a man who had everything to lose and nothing to concede. But then investigators did something that shattered Mesagi's denials. They examined Ademir's cell phone. What they found on that phone was, in itself, a portrait of a predator's inner world. There were numerous photographs stored on the device. Photographs of underage young men, images that spoke to an obsession, a collection of the very type of target that Ademir had been hunting through the forest for months. Among those photographs was something more specific, more devastating, more directly relevant to the question of what had happened on September 22nd. A photograph placed Mesagi in the forest on the exact same day that Francisco and Josenildo had gone in to pick fruit and never returned. He had been there. The evidence placed him at the scene with a precision that his denials could not withstand. Furthermore, several of the survivors from Ademir's earlier attacks in the forest, the 20 or so victims from the months between March and September, had, during their descriptions of what happened to them, mentioned something interesting. Sometimes, they said, the attacker had not been alone. Sometimes there had been another man nearby, a man who resembled the description of Mesagi. The picture that assembled itself from all of this evidence was of 2 predators operating, at least partially in coordination, men who shared a preference for the same type of victim, who moved through the same geography, and who had, on the day that 2 brothers went into the forest to run an errand for their mother, committed acts of violence that took 2 young lives. For the families of Francisco and Josenildo, the news that the man responsible had been identified and arrested did not bring relief in any clean sense of the word. Relief is too small and too simple a word for what you feel when the man who killed your children is caught. What comes is something more complicated than relief. A terrible mixture of rage and grief and the dawning understanding that the system that was supposed to protect your children from exactly this kind of danger had failed, repeatedly and profoundly, at every level at which intervention was possible. Misagi was eventually tried separately. In 2009, he was convicted of participating in Josenildo's death and sentenced to 31 years imprisonment. He continued to appeal the sentence, continuing to profess innocence from behind bars, insisting that the evidence against him was wrong, that the photograph proved only his presence and not his actions, that he was not the man the prosecution had made him out to be. Whether the courts ultimately agreed or disagreed with those appeals is part of the ongoing legal aftermath of a case that, in its totality, exposed not just two predators but an entire institutional architecture that had allowed them to hunt. Meanwhile, Ademir Oliveira Rosario sat in custody and waited for the trial that would determine what the rest of his life would look like. Before that trial could begin, one more question needed to be answered. The same question that had been asked and answered in his favor 16 years earlier when he had killed the first time. Was Ademir Oliveira Rosario sane? There is a particular theater to the intersection of law and mental illness in serious criminal cases. A performance staged in courtrooms and examination rooms, where psychiatrists and attorneys and prosecutors all circle the same central question with very different investments in the answer. Is the person sitting in that chair the person who did what the evidence says they did, someone whose mind was functioning in a way that the legal system recognizes as responsible? Or is there something inside their head that pushes them beyond the reach of culpability? Something broken, something fractured, something that, if properly diagnosed and labeled, places them outside the category of people who can be held fully accountable for what their hands have done. This question had already been asked and answered once in Ademir Oliveira Rosario's story. In 1991, when he killed a man during a dispute, the answer that emerged from the legal process was insanity. He was not responsible. He was sent to a hospital instead of a prison. That answer had cascading consequences that stretched across 16 years and culminated in the deaths of two teenagers in a São Paulo forest. Now, in the months preceding his trial, the question was being asked again. The evaluation was conducted by one of Brazil's most recognized figures in forensic psychiatry, Dr. Guido Palomba, a man whose name carries considerable weight in Brazilian criminal proceedings, an expert whose conclusions carry the authority of long professional experience and a well-established reputation in the field. Palomba examined Ademir with the thoroughness that such an evaluation demands. He spent time with him. He assessed the evidence of his behavior not just in September 2007 but across the entirety of his documented history. The theft conviction, the killing, the 1991 acquittal, the psychiatric hospitalizations, the 1998 attack on the boys during his authorized outing, the years in Franco de Rocha, the months of predatory hunting on the forest trails, the murders. Palomba's conclusion was carefully worded but unmistakable in its implications. Ademir Oliveira Rosario, the psychiatrist concluded, exhibited psychopathic tendencies. He was, in Palomba's professional assessment, completely abnormal. The word was specific and significant, not casually abnormal in the way that a person might be called unusual or eccentric, but abnormal in the clinical diagnostic sense, in the sense that describes a fundamental divergence from the psychological patterns that characterize ordinary human functioning. And this was the pivot on which the entire legal case turned. Palomba ruled that Ademir was sane enough to stand trial. Completely abnormal but accountable. A psychopath but culpable. The distinction matters enormously because the legal concept of insanity is not synonymous with the clinical concept of psychological abnormality. You can be deeply disturbed and still be found legally sane. You can be diagnosed with psychopathic tendencies and still be found fully responsible for what you did. The law does not protect people from the consequences of their actions simply because their psychology is disordered. It protects them only in specific, carefully defined circumstances where the disorder rises to a level that demonstrably stripped them of the understanding or control necessary for criminal responsibility. Palomba concluded that Ademir's condition did not meet that threshold in relation to the 2007 murders. He was sane. He would be tried. His trial began in March 2012, more than 4 years after his arrest. 4 years during which Francisco and Josenildo's family had to live in the suspension of the unfinished. Their son's dead, the man responsible in custody but not yet sentenced, the legal process grinding forward on its own timetable with no regard for the urgency of grief. The courtroom in which Ademir was tried became a space where competing narratives of who he was and what had happened in the forest collided with the controlled violence of legal process. On one side was his attorney, Marcos Figueiredo Martins, who had a specific and familiar strategy: pursue an acquittal on the grounds of insanity, argue that his client's mental state at the time of the murders made full criminal responsibility impossible, and seek a return to the psychiatric system rather than a prison sentence. It was, in legal terms, a rational defense strategy given the history. Ademir had been acquitted on insanity grounds before. There was precedent. There was a diagnosed condition on record. The argument was not absurd on its face. But during the trial proceedings, Ademir himself made statements that complicated his own defense in ways that are difficult to fully reconcile with a portrayal of a man whose grasp on reality was so limited that he could not be held responsible. Speaking through the means available to him, through sign language, through the intermediaries and interpreters who conveyed his communications to the court, Ademir said that what he had wanted, when he encountered Josenildo in the forest, was to have an affair with him. He wanted a romantic relationship with the 13-year-old boy. And when Josenildo refused his advances, when the child said no to the man who had cornered him in the forest with a knife, Ademir described himself as having blacked out, as if the refusal of a 13-year-old child had extinguished his consciousness. As if the word no, coming from a boy who was terrified and had every right to refuse anything asked of him, had caused something to short-circuit inside Ademir's mind that then removed him from responsibility for what happened next. The blackout claim was a thread that ran through Ademir's account of both murders. The suggestion that the violence was not something he chose, not something he directed, but something that happened to him while he was absent, while his conscious self had stepped briefly off stage and left his body to its worst impulses. It was a narrative designed to build a wall between the man in the courtroom and the acts documented in evidence. Prosecutor Eduardo Campana dismantled that wall with the psychiatric record. Campana pointed to the evaluations. He pointed to Palomba's conclusion. He argued, with the directness that the evidence supported, that the psychiatric reports were clear. Ademir had been found sane at the time of the crimes. He was fully culpable. He had not been a man in the grip of a psychotic break that removed his understanding of what he was doing. He had been a predator who planned, who selected, who acted with deliberate, calculated intent. He had spent months working those forest trails before the murders. He had attacked approximately 21 people. He had evaded detection across weeks and months of predatory behavior. That was not the behavior of a man who blacked out. That was the behavior of a man who was entirely present, entirely purposeful, and entirely aware of what he was choosing to do. The jury heard everything. They deliberated, and then they returned a verdict that, given the weight of the evidence, was the only verdict the facts could sustain. Guilty. On 2 counts of rape and murder. Guilty of the rape and killing of 13-year-old Josenildo José de Oliveira. Guilty of the rape and killing of 14-year-old Francisco de Oliveira Neto. 2 boys who had gone into the forest on an errand for their mother. 2 boys who never came home. 2 boys whose naked bodies had been found among the trees 3 days after they disappeared. Their skin punctured by a knife wielded by a man who should never have been walking free in the world outside that psychiatric hospital. The sentence handed down by the court was 57 years imprisonment. 57 years. For their families, the number was both necessary and inadequate. The only thing the legal system had to offer in the face of something that no number of years behind bars can actually repair. Francisco was 14 when he died. Josenildo was 13. They did not get to be 15, or 25, or 40. They did not get careers or families or the ordinary accumulation of years that most people do not think about because they take it entirely for granted. They went into a forest on a September morning and they did not come out. And the man responsible went to prison for 57 years. But the trial and the sentencing were only one part of what needed to happen in the aftermath of this case. Because the failure that had allowed Ademir to walk out of the Franco de Rocha hospital in November 2006, the failure that had positioned him within reach of those trails of those 21 victims of those 2 brothers, was not just the failure of a single man's character. It was the failure of a system. When the full scope of what Ademir Oliveira Rosario had done became public knowledge, When the news broke across Sao Paulo that a convicted manslaughter offender, a diagnosed dangerous sexual predator, a man who had attacked children during authorized hospital outings, had been walking free on the trails of the Serra de Cantareira, hunting teenagers for months before finally killing two brothers who had gone into the forest to do something for their mother, the city did not respond with calm. It responded the way any community responds when it discovers that the structures it trusted to protect it have collapsed in ways that cost innocent lives. There was outrage. There were questions. There were demands for answers from every quarter. From the families of victims, from community members who used those forest trails, from advocacy groups, from journalists, from political figures who recognized in the Franco de Rocha scandal exactly the kind of institutional failure that demands public reckoning. The investigation that followed Adamir's arrest quickly turned its attention to the psychiatric hospital from which he had been released. What investigators found when they examined the inner workings of the Franco de Rocha facility was a portrait of institutional dysfunction so thorough and so systemic that it was difficult to identify a single point of failure, because the failure existed at every level simultaneously and comprehensively. The hospital was critically understaffed. The number of personnel responsible for monitoring, supervising, and managing patients bore no reasonable relationship to the number of patients requiring that monitoring, supervision, and management. Staff were stretched beyond any capacity to provide the kind of individualized, consistent oversight that patients with Adamir's particular risk profile required. The records that were supposed to track patients' conditions, behaviors, and progress were not being maintained in the rigorous, reliable way that the safety of both patients and the public demanded. The storage of medications for patients' medications that, in a facility of this kind, represent one of the primary tools for managing the behavioral and psychological conditions that made those patients a risk in the first place, was found to be inadequate, raising serious questions about whether the treatment regimes prescribed for individuals like Adamir were actually being administered and monitored effectively. In short, the hospital had been given the responsibility of managing one of the most dangerous people in the Sao Paulo metropolitan area, and had been given that responsibility without the resources, the staffing, or the operational infrastructure to discharge it safely. The probation policy, the authorization that allowed Adamir to take weekend leave from the facility, to move freely through Sao Paulo during those periods, to walk those trails, was the most visible and devastating product of that institutional failure. Because the decision to grant Adamir probationary leave was not made in a vacuum. It was made in an environment where proper assessment of his risk was structurally compromised by understaffing, where the records that should have tracked the 1998 attack on the boys during a previous authorized outing may or may not have been adequately integrated into his current risk profile, and where the gap between what a responsible psychiatric institution should do and what the Franco de Rocha Hospital was functionally capable of doing was wide enough for a serial predator to walk through. And walk through it he did. From March to September 2007, Adamir Oliveira Rosario used the freedom granted to him by a broken system to commit acts of violence against approximately 21 people. 21 survivors who carry what happened to them in those woods as a permanent weight. Not a memory that fades, not a wound that heals cleanly, but something integrated into the architecture of their lives, a before and an after with no road back to the before. The ages of his victims, the details of the assaults, the knife pressed against skin, the terror of being cornered in a forest where no one could hear anything. These are the experiences of real people who were real teenagers in 2007, who had full lives ahead of them, who went to the Serra de Cantareira because it was a beautiful place near where they lived and came out of it permanently changed by what a man operating under a broken system did to them. 21 survivors. And 2 who did not survive. Francisco de Oliveira Neto, 14 years old, from Jardim Parana, who went to pick fruit with his younger brother. Josenildo José de Oliveira, 13 years old, who went to help his mother. Their names should be said clearly and kept clearly, not as footnotes to the story of the man who killed them, not as supporting details in the larger narrative of institutional failure and legal proceedings, but as the irreducible core of what this case actually is. 2 children who were murdered in a forest because a series of adults and institutions failed at every critical juncture to do what they were supposed to do. The aftermath of the trial also meant that Masagi's case continued its own complicated trajectory through the legal system. Convicted in 2009 for his participation in Josenildo's death and sentenced to 31 years, He continued to push back against that verdict through the appeals process, maintaining throughout that he had not committed the acts attributed to him. The photograph placing him in the forest, the survivor accounts suggesting he had accompanied Adamir on previous attacks, the evidence of his relationship with Adamir and his own documented attraction to the same age group of victims. All of this had been sufficient to convict him at trial, but the appeals process allowed him to continue contesting the verdict from behind bars, a legal reality that the families of victims navigated alongside everything else the aftermath demanded of them. For the families of Francisco and Josenildo, for their mother, who had asked them to go to the forest that morning and who had spent 3 days not knowing where they were before the worst possible knowledge arrived. The legal proceedings resolved something without resolving everything. A verdict exists. A sentence exists. The man responsible has been named and confined. The system that produced him, that released him, that allowed him to hunt, has been examined and found wanting. But none of that returns 2 boys to a woman who asked them to run an errand. In the broader context of Brazil's relationship with its mental health care system, this case became a reference point. Not the only one, and not the last, but a specific and documented illustration of what happens when institutional failure occurs at the intersection of dangerous individuals, inadequate supervision, and the kind of bureaucratic inertia that allows a known risk to keep slipping through the same gaps year after year. The hospital in Franco de Rocha did not exist in isolation. It was part of a nationwide system with nationwide pressures. Underfunding, overcrowding, understaffing, and the failures identified in its management of Adamir were symptomatic of failures that existed, in varying degrees, across Brazil's mental health infrastructure. The advocacy that emerged from this case, the calls for reform, the demands that dangerous patients classified at the highest risk levels be managed under genuinely restrictive regimes rather than semi-open systems that provided the appearance of containment without the substance of it, joined a long history of such advocacy in Brazil and around the world, advocacy that has produced incremental change in some places and been absorbed without consequence in others. What is specific to this case, what makes it something other than a generic cautionary tale about systemic failure, is the precision of the horror. It is not abstract. It is not theoretical. It is Francisco, 14, and Josenildo, 13, going into the forest on September 22, 2007. It is their mother waiting for them to come home. It is 3 days of searching. It is bodies found naked among the trees. It is the knowledge, afterward, that the man who did it had been waving red flags at the system for 16 years, had killed before, had attacked children before, had been diagnosed as a dangerous sexual predator before, and that none of those flags had been enough to keep those 2 boys safe. Adamir Oliveira Rosario sits in a Brazilian prison today, under a sentence of 57 years, at an institution a world removed from the forests he once called his hunting ground. He cannot hear the sounds of the city. He cannot hear the wind through the trees. The world he inhabits is the same silent world it has always been. But the silence that once gave him power over his victims, the silence that made him a ghost on those trails, the silence that seemed to protect him for far too long, now simply contains him. The Serra de Cantareira still exists. The trails are still there. Families still walk them. Children still play on them. Sao Paulo still escapes to them when the city becomes too heavy to carry. The forest does not remember what happened in its shade in 2007. Because forests do not carry memory the way people do. The trees have grown. The paths are as they were. But some of the people who walk those trails today were survivors. People who were teenagers in 2007 and who now carry the weight of that September somewhere inside them, folded away but never fully gone. Some of them may never have told another person what happened to them in those woods. Some of them may have built full lives in the years since, raising families and working and living in ways that look, from the outside, completely whole. And some of them know, on a level that does not require words, that the forest holds things the daylight does not always show. The Cantareira maniac is in a cell. The forest is still beautiful. Both of those things are true. And the distance between them is the full, terrible weight of what this story has always been about. Not the monster, but the world that made room for him, and the children who paid the price for that accommodation. Francisco de Oliveira Neto, Josenildo José de Oliveira. Their names endure. Thank you for listening and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.